Tisha B'Av, thank you so much for that introduction, and Rishus Kol HaRabbonim, all the rabbis and distinguished community leaders, Rishus Kol HaKol HaKodesh Hazeh. Shiva also Tammuz, as we heard a moment ago from Rabbi Top, begins a 3-week period of mourning, customary mourning, that seems to increase as each week goes past. We fast today, but now we begin a period of time when we don't have a haircut, we don't listen to live music, and then we up the ante. On Rosh Chodesh Av, we stop eating meat. We stop washing. And then we get to Tisha B'Av and we begin to wallow in self-pity. And we spend half the day sitting on the floor and chanting lamentations. We almost seem to revel in misery and sorrow. And it is fair to ask, what exactly is this all about? And by that I don't mean, why are we doing it in terms of commemoration? We know, we just heard from the Rabbi. All those years ago, 3,500 years ago, Moshe Rabbeinu came down from the mountain and he sees the Jews dancing around the golden calf. And he takes the luchos inscribed by God with the 10 commandments and he chucks them, he throws them to the ground and they smash into smithereens. On Shiva also Tammuz we commemorate that dreadful event in our history. We commemorate the breach of the walls of Jerusalem, both by the Babylonians and by the Romans, which led ultimately to the destruction of not one but 2 of our temples. Historically, I get it. We all get it. We learned it in elementary school and we can recite it by rote. We know exactly what the 3 weeks commemorates. I don't mean that. That's not my question. My question is this. What is the purpose of commemorating these events? Of reminding ourselves of these horrific moments in our history? And I want to pad out this question and help you understand the depth of it, if I may, and please share these few moments with me. Firstly, we all know, we are obligated to serve God with joy and happiness. Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha. We are obliged, we are obligated to serve God in joy. In fact, in Parshas Ki Savo, we're going to read it in a few weeks' time. There are a whole bunch of curses which God utters and which we must recall and we recite them in a low tone. And one of those curses begins as follows. Tachas Hashem Elokecha b'simcha v'tuv levav. God will curse all those who do not perform the mitzvot in joy, in happiness, in bliss, with a smile on their face. That, my friends, is worthy of a curse. That is why we may suffer, because we do not worship God in joy. Are you trying to tell me that Chazal didn't know what it said in Parshas Ki Savo? That Chazal, that the Talmudic sages had not read this pasuk in the Torah, didn't know of what King David had said, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. That's not possible. So why in heaven's name are they asking us to sit in sorrow for 3 weeks, notwithstanding the historical events of the Jewish people, of the terrible, dreadful things that may have happened to us in our distant past? Why are we being asked, in a subversion of the laws of the Torah, to mourn and be sorrowful? Surely there must be some mistake. In fact, says Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, and he says it many, many times, depression and sadness are worse than sin itself. Those who are sad and those who are depressed have no chance to come close to God, have no chance of building a relationship with their Creator. Someone who sins can do teshuvah, he can come close to God, but sadness is a barrier preventing you from getting close to your Creator. How is it possible that Chazal would institute a period of time during which we must be mournful and sorrowful, and thereby distant from our Creator? Question 1. My second question is a little bit closer to home. It's one we've all thought of, and perhaps occasionally articulated, but one which deserves addressing in an open forum. Frankly, I feel no connection whatsoever to things that happened 2,000 and 2,500 years ago. Let's be honest. The temple may have been destroyed, and all the terrible things that we read in Eicha and in the Lamentations, the death and the destruction, the expulsions, the horrific torture and treatment of the Jews in those days, no doubt they were terrible. But we ourselves, we cannot connect to them. We don't know anybody who was there. We can't connect to the temples. We never saw the temples. We know nothing of Kohanim, of Machatzit HaShekel, of Karban Tamid. We don't know about the Leviim singing in the Beit HaMikdash. We've never had that experience. What are we mourning? How exactly are we meant to relate to something that doesn't resonate in our own lives? I mean, I know the things that make me sad. Traffic on the 405. Tuition payments. The Beit HaMikdash, I mean, it's a terrible thing, but it's in the history books. It's from the history books, and it's for the history books. And let me add another part to that question. Surely, over the many centuries that have followed the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, we have experienced the most terrible, terrible things that have been exacted against our people. The medieval crusades, the destruction of the Jews of the Rhineland, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, the Inquisition, Khmelnytsky, the pogroms against the Jews of Russia and Eastern Europe, the terrible, dreadful events of the Holocaust. And need I say more than in the last week, 1,000 rockets raining down on the state of Israel? Need I say more than the murder of 3 kidnapped teenagers? Innocent youths standing at a bus stop. What exactly are we commemorating when we go back 2,500 years? Tisha B'Av should be about 3 murdered, kidnapped teenagers. It should be about 1,000 rockets. It should be about Rahman and Islam, the first victim, the first person who died today as a result of mortar fire at the Erez checkpoint. Why do we hop back 2,500 years? What exactly has it got to do with us? And we know the answer that's given. That in essence, the galut that we are going through now is a continuation of the galut that began with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. It's all one galut. It's all one terrible, dreadful long period of time that we are commemorating during this 3 weeks. Which brings on the next question, which is, why do we have all this suffering? Why do we, the Jewish people, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, millennium after millennium, have to endure the indignity of persecution and suffering, killing, murder, hatred? What is it all about? And I want to add one final question. And it's a fairly random question. It's one that's bothered me for many, many years. There is a Gemara. A Gemara at the beginning of Bava Basra discusses the construction of the temple of Herod. King Herod. Anyone know about King Herod? King Herod was a sort of half-Jewish king toward the end of the Roman occupation of Judea. King Herod was, by all accounts, and I'm not discussing now the accounts in the Talmud, I'm talking all accounts, was a very wicked man. He would have fit very well into the cast of Game of Thrones. Somebody who murdered his own family to keep himself in power. He killed the last of the Hashmonaim. He killed hundreds of rabbis. He murdered and killed his way into power and held on to power for 40 years and did some of the most terrible things ever done by a Jewish leader to his people. And Chazal, the Gemara there, describes the sequence of events. It's Daf Daled Amud Aleph. The sequence of events that led to the construction of Herod's temple. Herod's temple was the second temple. It had gone into a state of disrepair, and he repaired it. And he didn't just repair it, he enhanced it. And he created that very large platform that we know as Temple Mount. He created that. It was a feat of mechanical genius at the time. And the Gemara there describes why this evil man would have gone through the motions of creating a temple and how it happened. And I won't go into the details of that particular narrative. I want to seize on one phrase in the Gemara. The Gemara there tells us, Omri, they said, Mi shelo ra binyan hurdus, he who has not seen the temple of Herod, lo ra binyan noeh miyomov, hasn't seen a beautiful building in his life. It is an astounding statement. It's absolutely remarkable. This killer, this murderous imp, who was possibly the most violent king of that period, this man is identified with the most beautiful building of all time, and not just any building. The central building of our faith, the Beit HaMikdash, mi shelo ra binyan hurdus, lo ra binyan noeh miyomov. He who hasn't seen this building will never have seen the most beautiful building in his life. How is it that the rabbis of the Talmud felt it necessary to inform us about the Beit HaMikdash, the temple of Herod? Why would we want to identify this wicked man with the most beautiful building, our temple? And in particular, what makes it strange is the fact that Barbara was edited, which was some 500 years later. The people who inserted this phrase, Ravina and Rav Ashi, they inserted this phrase into the Gemara. They knew that not one person who would read the Gemara would ever have seen the temple of Herod. And they would never have the possibility of seeing this beautiful building. Why make us upset at this omission in our religious lives? And one last thing. We know from Malachim that the temple built by Shlomo HaMelech, Solomon's temple, was a most beautiful building. Why would we want it to be superseded in our literature? Why would we want to identify Herod as a greater builder of a temple than Shlomo HaMelech himself? So just to recap, 4 questions. Why would Chazal, how could Chazal create a commitment for us to be sad for 3 weeks? Surely this runs counter to our understanding of the way we're meant to observe Judaism in joy. Secondly, how are we to mourn something that happened so long ago? It doesn't relate to us. And surely we've had more tragedies, more terrible tragedies, closer to home in recent times. Thirdly, if our more recent tragedies are part of that same elongated period begun at the destruction, why the suffering? Why do we endure this suffering? And finally, why would the Gemara tell us that the temple of Herod was the most beautiful building of all time? Why tell us this piece of information? What relevance is it to us? I recently started a new chavrusa with a member of my community, Young Israel. And we were debating before we began learning together what we should study together, what text we should look at together. He said he'd been through Daf Yomi, he wasn't interested in learning Gemara. I suggested Halacha. He said Halacha is a bit dry for him. And we finally decided we're going to study Medrash together. He said he'd like to do that. He understood that Art Scroll has now translated much of the Medrash, so we could do it together, and then he could do Chazorah at home. And we began studying Medrash. We began a couple of months ago. Now there's 2 types of Medrash. There's a Medrash which really pads out the story, gives us narrative additions to the stories of Tanakh. And there's another type of Medrash, using the text of Tanakh to give us ethical lessons. There's often overlap, but those are the 2 distinct types of Medrash that exist. The Medrash Rabbah at the beginning of Shemos is a curious collection of verses and phrases describing the relationship between a father and a child. Why it is that he who spares the rod will regret it later. Someone who doesn't discipline their child, someone who doesn't give the correct type of education to their child, tough love, will reap the negative rewards later on in that child's life. And it goes through various scenarios in the Tanakh. It begins with Yaakov Avinu, who came to Mitzrayim with all his sons as one. And the Medrash points out because they were all equal to Yaakov in as much as he'd educated them properly and they were fully committed to the Torah. The Shiftei Kol. Unlike, says the Medrash, Yishmael, the son of Abraham. And it proves fairly tenuously, I have to say, that Yishmael worshipped idols. But Yitzchak, on the other hand, he was worthy of being one of the Avot because he did heed his father's education. Similarly, Yaakov and Esau. Similarly, David HaMelech and his 2 children, Avshalom and Adonijah, as opposed to Shlomo HaMelech. And the reason the successful child was successful is because the father gave him a tough time and told him the way it was and how it had to be. Whereas the other child, the wayward child, the child that went, so to speak, off the derech and left our history, that child had been dealt with too leniently. And ultimately, says the Medrash, ultimately, if you don't treat your child with the correct discipline, it means that you hate your child. Because true love demands of a father that he brings the best out of his child. True love demands that you want to see your child succeed as you succeeded. And that requires you being on top of him right from the very start. And ultimately, that child will love you more and be far more successful than the sum of his parts, and will achieve greater things as a result of that tough love that you put into him earlier on in his life. And the Medrash uses the psukim as a way of proving the point. And as I said, not always in a way that would somehow fit in with the pasuk, but the message is clear. And it's only towards the end of the Medrash, and it's a long piece, you can look at it, that finally begins to make sense when the Medrash says as follows, and you may have heard this before. To prove his point, the Medrash says, you can find 3 wonderful gifts that God gave to the Jewish people. And each and every one of these 3 things he gave to the Jewish people in a tough manner, in a manner that was hard for them to accept. But ultimately, they were the most wonderful gifts that any nation could want, collectively and individually. And those 3 gifts are HaTorah, Eretz Yisrael, and Chaye Olam Haba. The message of the Medrash is, we endure suffering, we endure persecution, but we endure it so that we can be the recipients of the greatest gifts that God can give. We endure it so that we can have the Torah. We, the chosen nation of God, can have and observe and study the Torah. We, the chosen nation of God, are the recipients of a land flowing with milk and honey. We are the recipients of the holy land, Eretz Yisrael, but we received it and receive it only al yedei Yisurim. Now, the traditional method of understanding this Medrash is that it was only through the slavery in Egypt that we got to Matan Torah. That was our route. And it was only through the conquest of Joshua against the inhabitants of the land of Canaan that we got Eretz Yisrael. That is the traditional understanding. But I want to suggest as follows. It's an ongoing commitment by God. No pain, no gain. Ask anybody who works at a gym. You want to have big muscles? You've got to pump the iron. You want to lose weight? You've got to stop eating those things that you like. Only al yedei Yisurim will you get the things that you want and that ultimately you need. Our relationship with God, our powerful relationship as his chosen nation, is one where we endure the tough love of a Father who loves us so much collectively that he expects us to understand that ultimately the gift of Torah, the gift of Eretz Yisrael, the gift of Chaye Olam Haba is only al yedei Yisurim. We must endure it, we must understand it. And the true joy of those gifts, the true understanding of the greatness of those gifts, can only be evident to us if we understand the suffering that we have endured. If we forget the Beit HaMikdash and its destruction, we cannot look forward to another Beit HaMikdash. We only understand the gift of Eretz Yisrael. Somebody wrote me an email today. There was an anti-Semitic incident in Antwerp, Belgium. Some terrible incident. And somebody wrote me an email today saying it's like Europe in the 1930s all over again. And I emailed back and I said, you're absolutely right, but the difference is now they have somewhere to go. We have a land, we have a country, we have a government. Now we have somewhere to go. Do we appreciate it? when we understand the suffering, when we understand the history of our people. The rabbis are not interested in suffering, in misery, or in mourning. They are interested in joy, in Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, in avodas Hashem. That's what they want. By commemorating our history of suffering, by understanding it, by appreciating it, by absorbing it into our bones, we can begin to appreciate our incredible future, the future that awaits us. We can look forward to a spectacular finale. The state of Israel, with all of its incredible success, is just the beginning, my friends. Our future is brighter than ever. As we recall every horror of the destruction of our 2 temples, we can smile in anticipation of a 3rd one, which will be better and more beautiful than both. As we remember every crusade, every pogrom, every persecution, we can understand ever more deeply how God cares for us collectively, the only nation and religion that has survived intact since the dawn of time. My friends, I have no idea if the temple of Herod was more beautiful than the temple of Solomon. I only have the words of the Gemara to go by. And I'm assuming that the people who edited the Gemara had no idea either, because they started off the phrase by saying, Va'amri, and they said. The point they were making was not that Herod was greater than Solomon, but having endured more centuries of suffering, the reward of the Beit HaMikdash that came in that period, 100 years before the destruction, was even more beautiful, was even more special than the temple that Solomon had built. My friends, every time another rocket is launched at us from Gaza, even as we huddle together in shelters and shiver in fear at the hatred our enemies have for us, we can also smile, because we can understand that the Messianic era is closer than ever, and that soon, very soon, maybe this year, we will all be celebrating Tisha B'Av as a holiday of national salvation and redemption. That is why the Kabbalah teaches us that Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. Our salvation is born while we appreciate the suffering. That is when we'll appreciate the joy. Let us hope that this year we will celebrate that holiday of national salvation on Tisha B'Av. And may we all spend Tisha B'Av together, celebrating the reconsecration of the 3rd Beit HaMikdash, B'mehera v'yameinu, Amen v'Amen.
Amen.